Man was seeking his identity for a long time. Finally, finds out who he is. There isn't a single worthless life, useless truth, or wasted effort. Each person we meet holds their own tale, a distinct tale no one else knows. This has its roots in people's childhoods, rearing, friends, school life, and most of all, the choices they make. Our tale still leaves some people with mixed emotions, and it's certain you too will think there's something weird about the question. When your life feels pretty normal, what happens when it stops being so ordinary? What if a single truth makes that happen and crashes it down? Something like that happened to a man in his 30s, and his life absolutely changed after finding out one truth. And no ordinary truth could make such a difference. After all, this was an answer to the myriad of questions that used to be on his mind about his life. Steve Carter, now 39 years old, was used to living an ordinary life until his inquiring mind exposed the tremendous answers about his life. The Carter family decided to adopt Steve when he was only 3.5 years old. His parents had told him all they knew about his life before he was part of their family. Steve was informed that his parents found him in a foster care center in Hawaii, but his interest in knowing his origins and the desire to find out more about his real family set him on a path to several surprisingly weird details. Steve Carter Sr. is a United States Army officer who was posted on the Oahu Island in Hawaii in 1980. His wife, Pat, worked as a teacher and was staying on the island with him. This was the time when the two of them decided on an adoption. After going to a nearby foster care center, they immediately could feel a powerful connection with one boy who was 3.5 years old. It was love at first sight, admitted Pat in an interview. The young, fair-haired boy was given to the foster care center in June 1977, only 3 years before, and as stated in his records, his name was Tenzin Amiya, and it also specified that he was born on January 16, 1977. The records also contained a short story regarding his birth parents, his father, a native Hawaiian, and his mother, Jane Amiya, who he was taken from after she was detained 5 months after his birth. There was nothing more to know about them. After all the papers were finished and signed, the Carters gained complete custody of the child on September 23, 1980. He was welcomed with a new name to his new home, William Stephen Tenzin Carter. Once named Tenzin, the boy, now known as Steve Jr., didn't take too much time getting used to a new lifestyle. The family moved back to their hometown from Hawaii soon enough, and Steve Jr. had his childhood days in the small town of Medford Lakes, southern New Jersey, the Garden State. The turn of luck for this boy was amazing. In the 1980s and 90s, Tenzin, now called Steve Jr., lived a simple, happy life with his family and friends, as he was kept busy with various sports or parties with the rest of the neighborhood children. His was the life that every orphan longs for, but few get a chance to live. Steve got his chance, and he was never ungrateful for it. And even though everything looked like it was going perfectly, Steve Jr. kept wondering about his previous life and the identity of his biological parents. Steve Sr. said in an interview that, for several years after his adoption, Pat and I had a nagging fear that someone might pop up claiming to be his biological mother and father. When nobody did, our anxiety eventually passed. Then he added, we kept in contact with the woman who had him in foster care. We called her when we had questions about measles or mumps and sent her letters during the holidays. Once he'd fully become an adult, Steve Jr. reached the time to leave his family's home in order to continue studying software at the university. Having a wonderful childhood with absolutely understanding parents who never failed to believe in his dreams, he was heartened to do what he likes. Steve was sorry to leave his family behind, but also equally happy about the new life that was ahead of him. At the time, he had no idea that soon it was his past that would come to face him. Steve's father confessed in an interview that we belong to an adoptee/birth parent clearinghouse, ALMA, that connects people who are looking for each other but never received any messages. When Steve turned 18, we asked him if he wished to continue registering on the site, and he declined. Yet soon his son's curiosity about it would renew. Because he was living away from his family, Steve started to think about his biological parents, who were always the laughingstock back home. His father illustrated this point in an interview. With his blonde hair, blue eyes, and a light complexion, he does not strike one as being of Polynesian extraction. A puzzling fact for Steve Jr. now, because the records stated that he was Hawaiian, yet his face didn't match it. Because of so many things going through his head, Steve made the decision to find out if he's Hawaiian or not. As a Christmas present, he bought himself a DNA testing kit, and without giving it a second thought, took the test. The result from the test was a complete contradiction of what the Carters previously had assumed. When Steve got the results, he couldn't come to terms with the fact he was of Scandinavian origin, making him a European. Although he'd wished the test would end his questions and help him to live an ordinary life, he was now more stumped than ever. Steve was pushed by many, signed right back to his past. A story of an African-American woman, Carlina White, caught Steve's attention back in 2011 as he could relate himself to her. She was stolen from a hospital in Harlem, New York City when she was a baby, and had no clue about her real life while she was growing up in Connecticut. Even after 23 years, Carlina White had the same story that her kidnapper was her biological mother. At the same time, her real parents never gave up looking for her and didn't know she was living only 45 minutes away from them. And immediately, Steve knew something had to be done. His father remembers. Then Steve read about Carlina White, who discovered she was kidnapped as an infant from a hospital in New York. The article mentioned references that she used for her search. Steve was a family man by then and had a lot of doubts whether he should try this out or not. During such troublesome times, his wife, Tracy, always gave him support and insisted on him trying things out because it could lead him to a point where he could rest his past at long last. Thanks to Carlina's story, Steve regained a lot of energy. Because of the internet, he knew that methods for genealogy to track relatives lost a long time ago appeared like an extremely easy project. Following the same method Carlina had used, Steve started looking for his long-lost parents on a site sponsored by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Once Steve had gotten access to the website, he started to scroll his days away. When he went through more than 100 pages, he immediately stopped at a photo, feeling numb for a second. That was the start of the untangling of the web, and Steve had no clue how to start. Was there somebody out there looking for him? And if there was, how is it possible he was given into foster care? After Steve found the picture of a teen looking just like him, he called his parents right away and told them to look at the site. His father remembers, it was the spitting image of Steve. He called Pat and me immediately and told us to look at the website. We were flabbergasted. On the list of boys that were missing was one named Marks Panama Moriarty Barnes, who was missing from June 1977. Besides his name stood a sketch of his age progression, meaning a sketch of how he might look like today as a teenager. Steve remembers the moment. I got chills. I was like, holy crap, that's me. Unsure about what he had seen, Steve instantly made the decision to contact the police in order to make sure this was the reality. After he was led through the process of DNA testing, Steve got the rest done by professionals now, and yet it would take more than 8 months for the results to come. And 8 months later, after Steve had bravely waited, the results came in. The DNA results recorded that Steve and Marks were the same person. Unsure whether he wished to meet with anyone that made the missing person report on the site, Steve's wife Tracy proposed to him that he should continue on and find out the entire story of how he ended up in Hawaiian foster care in 1977. And Steve was determined to know everything at last. After digging in deeper, Steve found out that a journalist and Vietnam War veteran, Mark Barnes, was gardening in his home in Oahu, Hawaii on June 21, 1977. He'd been living there with his then-girlfriend, Charlotte Moriarty. That day, she'd taken their son, a 6-month-old baby, to the nearby grocers, while Mark was occupied with his plants. She waved goodbye and left, never to return. Because Charlotte was known for having the habit of leaving without informing anybody and returning when she wanted, and she was a free bird, Mark only told the police she was missing after Charlotte didn't return home after 3 weeks. The police could not trace her, and they never found either her or Mark's, and their photos remain on the missing persons report for years without yielding results. With the photos in his hands, Mark had looked for them both for more than a year in the nearby places but never found his family. He never had the idea that small Marks was living a completely different life as another child very far away. Steve found his father, and yet he wanted to know about his mother, and looked for her more, only to find out even weirder truths. His birth father remembers, "I spent about a year and a half going crazy driving around the island. It was rough." Actually, when Charlotte had taken Marks for their typical walk, she altered their path and just moved to another part of Oahu. There, she came across an empty house by chance. Once the owner had returned, she informed the police because she could feel something was wrong. But when they arrived, Charlotte was successful in tricking them, and that changed their fates forever. Once the police found them, Charlotte gave them made-up names for her and Marks. She said they were named Jane and Tenzin Amiya, respectively. The police asked for her son's birth date in order to check her story, and she immediately made up a fake date of birth as well. Unfortunately, this got the police to believe her, and it never crossed their minds that Tenzin could be the missing child, Marks. Marks was sent to the foster care center when Charlotte got diagnosed with mental illness and detained in a psychiatric ward. After a few days, Charlotte was able to run away from the hospital and couldn't be found again. When she went missing, the truth about her son disappeared as well. For the next 3 years, Mark lived only 30 miles away from his real dad's place, with no one the wiser or any idea where he was. But his disappearance affected more people than just his dad. Jennifer, the other person besides Marks, an 8-year-old half-sister of Marks, also did not lose hope that he'd come back, and she always prayed for her younger brother. She was able to convince the police to reopen the files again in 2001, and as this is the procedure for such cases, they'd employed an artist to make a sketch of Marks's possible features as a teenager. And this was the picture Steve Jr. found and exposed his true identity. Contrary to what anticipated from Steve, even after the truth was exposed, he wasn't rushing to meet up with his real father and half-sister. In an interview, he confessed he felt terrified and wasn't at all ready to meet his new old family. Jennifer remembers scanning crowds to find her missing brother while she was growing up. "I felt like we'd taken someone else's child, though that wasn't true. Truthfully, I thought they were dead. I was really numb," she said. And as the truth was out in the open now, Steve wasn't ready yet to meet his biological family. Steve had made the decision to take his time in order to become comfortable with the idea how he can now meet his real father. After months of finding the truth, he then called Jennifer, his sister, and afterwards talked with Mark, his birth father as well. Mark, now living in California, was overwrought after hearing his son's voice. He recalls the moment, "All I could say was, wow, oh wow, wow." Steve's adoptive family was also, just like Steve, hitting with their own fears as well. They remember thinking, "On an emotional level, I felt like we'd taken someone else's child. It's taken a while for us to get used to the idea that we have to share him, but I'm sure it's going to be wonderful." Steve Carter Sr. said in an interview that Steve has spoken to his biological father several times. Pat and I have not. We have no plans to meet him, but with Steve's permission, we might somewhere down the road. For both of them, it took a long time to get comfortable with it. Steve's adoptive father wanted to find out more about his son's story and remembers, "We met the artist who created the photos Steve discovered on the web. We also met several investigators from the center and one from the Honolulu Police Department who all worked together on the case following Steve's initial contact." Steve's adoptive family has given a lot of thought to the police work that helped bring families back together again after their son had reunited with his biological relatives. He revealed that, "We learned about the wonderful work that the NCMEC does, not only to find missing children, but also to reunite parents and children who have been separated by disasters, such as Hurricane Katrina. It's an amazing group of highly skilled and dedicated people." Steve had at last taken the last step and met up with his biological father and sister, while the rest of the Carter family met them later in the year. They had, at last, come to terms with the fact that Steve is the son of both the families, and it was a poignant occasion for both. Steve's adoptive parents realized the extent of Steve's luck to have been able to reunite with his family while also live a happy life with the Carters. "We believe Steve's story is one of hope for all those parents who have suffered and continue to suffer the unexpected disappearance of a child," they said. Missing family members can now reunite thanks to the internet and police hard work. Steve and Jennifer are able to stay in touch, and they meet up whenever their time allows them to, as their reunion was an incredible miracle. Thanks to Steve's tale, the light of hope still is burning for all the ones who are still searching for their lost families. Even though the chances diminish with each passing year, Hope still remains in a deep place inside, and after finding out tales like this one, people try their best to have the case files open on their lost members and put the missing image on bigger scales, like some missing people's sites sponsored by the police. Steve Jr.'s tale is beyond extraordinary. Even when there's a person that went missing and people turn towards posting on Facebook, which did help in many cases, what's the percent that was able to come back to their biological families? If someone's loved ones are lost in the world, it's not often they ever get reunited. Had Jennifer not persisted in her efforts to have the case files reopened, and had Steve not also given his try after hearing the story of Carlina, the stolen girl, they never would have been able to get the perfect conclusion to their tale.